Hey, I'm Rob with DIY Built, and today I'll walk you through how to make a crosscut sled for your table saw that guarantees you'll get repeatable cuts every single time. I've also added some cool safety features into it to make it much safer for cutting those small pieces. First, let's go over the key safety and functionality features of this sled. Then I'll show you how to make it step by step. This sled is customizable to fit almost any table saw, and one of the standout safety features is the handles on both sides of the sled, which allows you to safely guide your cuts while keeping your hands free and clear of the blade area. Plus, there's a cover that keeps the blade fully encased should it exit the back of the sled. It's designed so the blade can only come out if you push the sled almost completely off the saw. As for functionality, I've added 2 T-tracks on either side of the blade, which allows you to clamp down your small parts tightly and safely, as well as a T-track on top with a stop block to get those consistent, repeatable cuts. Let's get into it. Most DIY cross sleds are built using 3/4 inch plywood, and that was my original design. However, I had a piece of 1/2 inch pre-finished birch plywood left over from some cabinet boxes, so I figured I'd double this up, increasing the actual sled deck to a full 1 inch. The overall size of the sled is 32 inches wide, 24 inches deep, and I will put a link to the downloadable plans to this build if you're interested in building one for yourself. Here I'm pre-drilling and adding a 3/4 inch screw to each corner to keep the 2 boards together. Then we'll flip it upside down and do the actual layout. And for whatever reason, the 2 pieces were not exact, so here I'm removing a sliver off the one side by running it through the table saw again. So by doubling up 1/2 inch, we've now got 1 inch of base, which obviously is a bit heavier than 3/4. So I'm going to change the shape of this a little bit, mainly just to lighten the load of the overall sled. I'm not using any glue, so just screws, making sure to countersink each screw so it doesn't drag on the table of the saw. First, I'm going to find center. We're exactly 32, so our center line is 18. Oh, that's not right.
You are incredible at math.
Well, let's try this again. 32 inches, 16 is center. I'm going to do a 16-inch back plate, 8 on each side. So 45-degree angle down. Takes a little bit of weight off of the corners of the sled. Also, I'm going to lay out where the T-track will sit so that we can avoid those areas when screwing the base together. I'm placing the track 4 inches on either side of the center line, and this is personal preference and is largely determined by the types of hold-down clamps you plan on using. Now, if you decided to use a 3/4 inch piece for your base, you can avoid all these extra steps. However, I did want to include it in the video just in case there is someone as crazy as I am. So let's just speed through this section, get all the screws installed, then we can get on to more important parts of the build. Now we can take it over to the miter saw and just cut these angles off. This will be our back wall on the far side of the table saw. This is our front wall where our stop and track will be. Now we can go ahead and transfer our track lines over to the front. For the T-track grooves, I'm using a 3/4 inch flush trim bit in my router along with a scrap piece of plywood as my guide. I will link all the products and tools used in the description of the video, so if you don't have something on hand, you can easily get to it. Then we'll go ahead and test it. And that's perfect. For the front and rear fence material, I'm using doubled up 3/4 inch fir plywood. The finish heights of the fence will be 3.5 inches. I've cut them larger for the glue up and will resize them once the glue is dried. I'll throw some clamps on here, set them aside, and on to the next step. Don't let that glue dry. I'm going to offset the blade 1.25 inches off center. Reason being because my T-track on the other side lines up to the table saw miter slots. By offsetting it 1.25 inches, it takes my T-tracks off of lining up with these miter slots. Now for the runners underneath, I do have a chunk of oak here. Oak is a pretty stable hardwood. It's only 20 inches long. The sled is 24 inches long, but I think if I split 2 inches on either side, front and back, that should work fine. Try to get this to fit in the groove as tight as possible without any slack. And these T-tracks fit perfectly. So I'm going to bring this fence up to the track, lock it down, cut it at that width. Then take that piece and cut it in half. So we want our runners to sit just proud of the tabletop. And if you have some washers, you can use that. I just have a bunch of dimes. And we'll test that. And we are just proud of the table saw top. And then we want to run a light bead of glue along each glide. Not enough where it's going to run over onto your table, but also just enough for it to allow the sled table to adhere to it. And then we can lift the whole thing off when it's dry and put some screws in it. And I'll throw some weight on there. Once the glue is dry, you want to flip the sled base over and countersink some holes into the runners. I'm using 1-inch number 6 screws, being careful not to over tighten, which can expand the runner, resulting in way too much friction. And let's be honest, too much friction, not always a good thing. And now we'll go ahead and give it a try, slide it into the miter slot. And you want it to slide smoothly. This has got a little bit of drag right there. It's about 95%. So if you've got a little bit of drag like that, what you can do is just turn it over, lightly sand down edges. You don't want any slop between the miter slots at all. So just take off a little bit at a time and see if you can eliminate the tightness. And I'm using 60 grit paper. Just taking a little bit at a time, because again, we don't want it to have any movement side to side. That's much better. We'll put a little paste wax on the runners themselves and in the miter slots. And it's also a good idea to put the paste wax on your table as well. It just helps all your material slide smoothly. And that should make for a really smooth sled. Now we can get back over to our front and rear fences that we glued up, remove all the clamps, and get them cut down to size. And if you have any glue squeeze out, it's really easy just to scrape it off with a chisel, and then we can run it through the table saw to get to our finished sizes. Just for reference again, the rear fence is 32 inches long, 3.5 inches high, and the front fence will be 16 inches by 3.5 inches high. All right, so we want to mount our front block first. Now I made this too long so that it can sit between the T-track slot, and then we'll use the rest of this for later on in the build. Over to the miter saw and cut it down to 7 3/4 inches. That will give us an 1/8 of an inch reveal on either side for our T-track accessories. For the front fence, we do want to glue and screw it into place, and clamps will help you hold it in place until you can drive in the 4 2.5-inch screws. Finally, we can run our first cut through the front fence
and base, making sure to stop about 6 inches from the front of the sled. Do not run your sled completely through the saw at this point. Before installing and squaring up the rear fence, I want to insert my T-track by cutting a rabbet joint into it by using the table saw. And here I'm just lowering the blade to the exact height of the track and setting the fence to the width I can get the perfect slot for this track.
Now we can go ahead and mount the back fence. I'm not going to mount it flush with the back. I'm going to move it 4 inches ahead. There's a couple reasons for that. One being a safety issue. The blade will be coming through here and we want to stay clear of this area. I'm building a block set in here that will enclose the blade into that area. And the second reason is just me being thrifty, I guess. I only bought 2 of the 36-inch T-tracks. So if I bring it right to this point, which is exactly 4 inches, it leaves me 16 inches on that end, another 16 inches here, which will be enough to cover the T-track on the top of the fence because this whole sled is only 32 inches wide.
You see, that's what you have to do. You have to use your mind.
The rear fence must be squared to the blade, and this is absolutely the most important step of the entire build. Start by driving in one 2.5-inch screw on one end of the fence from the underside. This will act as a pivot point to help us square up the sled to the blade.
To square up a fence as close as possible, I'm just going to take a framing square, set it against the fence, and then slide the fence forward until it looks as close as possible to our cut line. That's about as square as I can get at this point. Now we'll clamp the one end, put a screw in there.
Now we just want to run the blade up to the fence, but not actually through the fence.
To make sure the fence is completely square or as close to it as we will ever need, I'm going to use a 5-cut method. Basically, you take a block of wood, you cut it, flip it, cut it, flip it, cut it, flip it, cut it 4 times, and then your 5th time we cut it. And then we're going to use a set of digital calipers to check the width on that end and that end and see how close we are. So 30.2, and on this end, 30.32. That is super close enough for me. Now we can go ahead, put some screws along the entire fence line on the underside. Now we can go ahead, put in our T-tracks.
And here I'm scribing the T-track, then I'll take it over to the miter saw to cut it.
One of my least favorite things to do.
If you don't feel comfortable cutting the aluminum track with a miter saw, you can opt to use a grinder or even a hacksaw will do the same thing. Now take the 2 pieces we cut off and butt them together for the top of our rear fence stop block.
Factory cut on the outside again. And I'm also going to use a 2-part epoxy on the track slots before I put the screws in, just to give it a little bit extra holding power. Table saw sleds have a danger zone. It's where the blade comes through your fence. There's always a risk of that area causing injury. To eliminate some of the risk, I'm using 2x4 block to go dead center so that the blade always sits within a chunk of wood if it comes through. Then I'm going to use the T slots that we routed in earlier as a support base for our cover. Basically just building a box around the blade. And that'll be our protection box, our danger zone that we know to stay away from.
And here's a quick reference for our blade block protection area pieces.
Utilizing our leftover block from our support block, what was left over at the end, I've cut that into 2, cut off a couple dog ears on each side, and those will be our supports for the two sides. It will support the fence itself. And finally, 2 1.25 inch dowels that we'll use as handles. I got this design from Matt over at 731 Woodworks. So thanks for that idea, Matt. I thought it was a great safety feature, so I'm going to implement it into my sled.
Over to the drill press to hog out holes in the 2 outside fence pieces along with the 2 inner walls of the blade protection box. Now I'm only drilling 3/4 inch into each piece so that we can glue the dowels into place. Now if you're asking yourself why so much smoke, well, that's just me using a dull bit because that's all I could find in an 1.25 inch size. Start with a 2x4 blade plug by gluing it and centering it on the cut line. Next, the back wall can be glued to the sled deck as well as the blade block. From there, glue the 2 side supports into the miter slots and finally glue and set the top plate on. For this step, you can use screws or brad nails to secure the box together. Now we can get the 2 dowel handles set into place. Glue and set the inside of the dowels first, then set the outside supports and the dowels together. Use clamps to hold the outer fence supports to the fence, then flip it over, add 2 2.5 inch screws to the underside of the fence supports. And finally, 1 bar clamp to keep pressure on those dowels from end to end.
One last thing I do want to deal with is the safety around our blocked out blade area. We blocked this out, we put blocking inside so the blade is running through wood. There's a chance you could have your hands here, whether you're new to woodworking, and even more so if you're like me and you've used the table saw for most of your life, you get comfortable using things and not paying attention. To make this a little more noticeable and in my face and a reminder to keep my hands clear of this area, I'm going to put some stickers across here that warn me of impending danger. You could stencil an X on here, you could paint it red, you could do whatever you want. I happen to have a roll of caution sticker which I'm going to use on here. I put a polyurethane on this area so that the sticker will stick. Alright, so that's about as safe as I can make this. We've got handles, we've got markings on the blade area, and that pretty much completes the build of this crosscut sled. Again, I'll put plans in the description below, along with the links to all the products I used in this build. So if you want to build this exact sled, go ahead and check those out. And if you haven't subscribed, think about subscribing, and we'll see you on the next build.